Welcome to the tutorial on working with C. I had to make a retake of the entire course, taking note of certain things that needed improvement. So we take it from the beginning, where we'll actually introduce what our code blocks is, how we work with our code blocks, and the content that we need to learn for our code blocks. So we'll start by actually opening what code blocks is. We'll be explaining a few things as we go along. I'm hoping to guide you each step of the way and explain what our code blocks does. So I'm going to make it a bit detailed, a little bit slower than the first video, but I will tell you each step in each process that we've got. So if you are starting for the very first time, you won't have recent projects, but because I've been using this for all my lessons, I've got recent projects. I've got my file, edit, search, you name it. So let's just do the easiest. I go on create project. I select the console application. I select go. I select C. Click on next. I then put the title of my project, which will be Intro to C Program Design. That's what I named the course. If I don't have anything created, I'll need to actually pick a path, which is that. So in this particular case, I've got users, I've got Bumble, I've got documents, I've got code, and then I've got the file name, which is the name of the project, the resulting file name, which is Intro to C Program Design, which is my project. So I click on next, then the compiler automatically picks up. I click on finish, and then I have my project here. So you then find by default this sources is actually not expanded. I can click on the plus so that I get to see the expanded sources. I double click on main.c, and I've got my file that I'll be working with. So with my file, there's certain things that I'll need to have. So for example, this is my header file, standard input output, which stands for all the input and output that I want to put within my project will be stored in that particular file. Standard libraries, so it means anything that is stored in the libraries I can be able to use. I can be able to work with until I complete whatever it is that I want to complete. Then I've got my int main, where I've got my hello world and my return. So these contents, or this content, is something that I'll be able to work with and be able to use based on how I'm hoping to use it, how I'm intending to use it. Okay, so what I've actually just deleted is my hello world, which pretty much is a function, and it's a function that shows us a certain thing. So before we even go any further, we need to see what this gives us. So to see what this gives us, I have to click on that icon there, which is build and run. I've also just got run. I've also got just build. So we select build and run, and then you notice in the bottom here it says GCE executing. What have you quickly changed? But it's actually telling me the compiler that I'm using. So it tells me how it's going to execute and the number of seconds that it's going to take, plus the size of this program. So we then notice if I put this side by side, I've got hello world in line 6, and this is in quotations. When I go to my output, it just gives me hello world. So meaning printf does not print. It just gives us the output of hello world, which is what is within the quotations. And then you'd find our new line, which is this one, gives us this space that we've got here after we've typed out whatever it is that we've typed out. We put our new line, so it gives us a slightly different output, or the output then becomes different based on what we would have put. So the new line actually takes us from this particular line to the next line, and since there's nothing in that line, we can then see the space that is created by putting our new line. So it also then tells us process returned 0. So you find where it's saying returned 0, we've got our line 7, which is return 0. So it's actually giving us return 0, and it gives us a value of what it took to get to return 0 and the time it took to execute this. So the time it took to execute and our return means we are actually going back to the basics, or we're going back to what we would have wanted to do based on our processing, or based on processing in this particular scenario. Okay, so that then gives us the beginning of our code. So we might need to type out some content that we'll be able to work with in this regard. Okay, let's say we want to display a certain thing, or we want to learn some of the basics that we need to learn. There's always so much to learn. There's always so much we can work with, but it's all too broad in one particular lesson. So what we can then do is we can put some content that will help us learn certain things. So I've cleared up everything, but in clearing it up, I might need to also just add some content. Okay, so for one, or to begin with, we're then saying we need to have input, we need to have output. So we've got functions that do this. One such function is our printf, which we have used so far, and we've seen what it does. We've got our scanf, which is our input. Okay, this becomes output. Okay, let's say we've got something that we want to display to the user. So like enter a new value. Okay, we do that, and this then becomes our output. Okay, and then in getting our value, we put a %d, we put a comma, we put ampersand, we put a value that we want to work with. Okay, this then becomes our input. So our input works with something that we need to enter using the keyboard. Our output works with something that we need to have in terms of what our display should be. So okay, we can actually work with these two and say this is our input, this is our output. So maybe let's have just a few nodes that we can work with. Let me use Notepad++. And with our nodes, we then just explain some of the things that we've said there. We've said we need to have our input and output. Okay, which then means what is our input? Our input is our scanf. Okay, this gets the content of the keystroke. Okay, we've got our printf. This gives us a display of what we intend to gather. Okay, so that's what our printf and our scanf pretty much does. But at the same time now, we would actually then get to notice that in trying to explain our scanf, we then introduce something new. In trying to explain our printf, we then also introduce something new. So in our printf, we had a new line. This stands for new line. And this, what this simply does is it allows us to move to a new unused line, or in other words, if it's not putting it into a new unused line, we can also put it in this particular regard and say changes the location of the cursor, if we can call it a cursor, to a new line or paragraph in the execution, like that. So that's what our new line does. And then at the same time, we've also introduced that %d. We've also introduced a ampersand m, okay, where we can actually then say we can explain our ampersand, we can explain our m, we can also explain our %d, where we are saying our %d gets an integer value. Our ampersand assigns the value that is entered. So in other words, we're then saying the moment we have our ampersand, we want to actually equate it to the value that was entered. At the same time, m becomes our variable. Okay, this is our variable that we'll be getting at a given point in time. So in other words, we're then saying we're working with input and output. We are using our scanf to get the contents of a particular keystroke. Our printf gives the display of what we intend to gather. Our new line allows us to move on to a new unused line, changes the location of the cursor to a new line or paragraph in the execution. %d gives us our integer value. Ampersand assigns the value that is entered, and m becomes the variable. So these are some of the things that we then need to know about how our coding works. Okay, so given this now, we can actually now be able to create a program that does whatever it is that we want to do. So we need to first of all do what is known as a declaration. Okay, declaration. Okay, what does this mean? We need a data type and a variable name. That is what our declaration is. So we can simply say int m, okay, which then means we've declared m by having our data type and the variable name, which then works with what we want to work with. From there, we then want to be able to enter a value. So need a printf, and our printf will then get the contents of, or will then display what we want the user to enter, which will be as follows: enter a number. Okay, we put our new line so that we move on to the next line, and then we put our scanf. Our scanf, like we said, we need to put our %d, we'll put an ampersand, and then we get the value of m, which is the value that we want to work with. So this then becomes our code, where we've got our data type, we've got our variable name, we've got our printf, we've got our new line, we've got our scanf, we've got our %d, and our m. So if we just copy this as it is, since we are typing it in the order that we require, and we put it there, we should be able to see what this does. So if I run the program now, I would have actually had some code, or I would have added some code, where now it's telling me enter a number, so I can put a number, I press enter, and then we are done. So that's how we actually work with creating our values, or creating our first program, where, as you can see, everything side by side, our value that we've entered is 23, and 23 is then assigned to our variable, which is m. M then is received from scanf, which is our function that gets our values, and then our values are then stored into m. So at this particular point, we can't see how they are stored. We can only see how it is used and how we have used it to give us the result of whatever we would have placed in our code. So at this particular point, we can safely say that we have learned about how to use our variables, when we can use them, and how we can do certain things based on our variables.